So let's talk about it. What's crashing? What's rising? Transborder, big shock this last week. Today on the Logistics Life. Being my man, there is some things happening in our industry, buddy, that are just, for lack of a better word, insane. But I think we knew this was going to happen.
Yeah, I didn't think the whiplash effect would be as pronounced that it is in Canada, right? So I think your side of the border has been more, what's the word I'm looking for? More visceral, more emotional. There's a lack of trust factor. So a lot of people have made economic decisions around, for example, removing alcohol, all US alcohol from the shelves and having labels on Canadian-made goods, so shoppers have a choice in supermarkets. That's got nothing to do with demand, right, for goods necessarily, because people are still buying things cross-border. But it's like this emotional decision. So that's what I was really surprised by that reaction. I shouldn't have been, knowing Canadians, but because we're all part of the British Commonwealth, we all think alike when it comes to how life is. But the thing that's affecting truckers, Dan, if you've built your business around cross-border freight, I can't predict what's going to happen there, because tariffs could go away tomorrow and we could be back to normal, right? But what it does,
I don't know if I mean, from a trust factor, I don't know if it'll be back to normal. I think there's always going to be this skepticism, especially with the powers that be that are in charge. I think there's going to be this skepticism as like, when is the bottom going to fall out again? Right.
Yeah. So and I think it'll take time. We used the example last week about how during the 2018-19 tariff, China sought to de-risk, soybean purchases from America and went to Brazil, and Brazil's now the biggest supplier of ag products to China. I think there'll be some de-risking going on across all supply chains. It's a bit like when we started the 2018 tariff war with China, and people started to then develop what they call a China plus one supply chain strategy, where they had some redundancy in their supply chains. I mean, the pandemic taught us all to have redundancy in our supply chains, and that's when that term nearshoring became in vogue. And people said, well, why don't we just, nearshore it, aka Canada, Mexico, as being the place where we can get things made. Now, of course, Mexico is more favorable because of labor costs. And then, of course, what happened is China relocated a lot of factories to other parts of Southeast Asia. So when it comes in, it's not from China technically. And then, of course, you've got a lot of Chinese products coming into Mexico being warehoused, and 3PL sending it across the border. So we've just had a realignment of supply chains, and I suspect that's going to continue. It's a great time to be in logistics. Like, despite all the volatility and the angst that gets created by this, professionals like you are in great demand. So there will be change, but there's some permanency, I think, around cross-border volumes. I don't know that comes back to where it was. My sense is that we've had 2 weeks of sustained volumes of truckload freight from Toronto into that sort of Great Lakes, Midwest, Ohio, River Valley region. That's in that 250 to 750 mile range, where a lot of steel and other products come into the US. Then those volumes for Monday to Friday each week, and I count the number of loads every day, and I've been tracking it all the way back to 2018. The last 2 weeks have consistently been 50% lower. Right, so we're seeing half the volume come across the border. Now, part of that could be that we moved a lot of it before March 4 when the tariffs came in. So there was a bit of a push forward of volumes earlier in February. So that's part of it. But there's a pattern emerging here where volumes have fallen. And if I look at some of the Ontario data, generally speaking, it's the biggest freight market. It's about 75% of our loads moved cross-border in dry van. Those volumes, Dan, are flat. They're back to where they were a year ago. So they've come back after being up 20% month over month. They're back to flat. Rates have come down last week out of Ontario. Remember last week we were talking about rates up 30 cents a mile, then down 30 cents a mile this week. So there's a real whipsaw been going on when it comes to rates. So I suspect capacity has kind of got back to normal. If I look at Indianapolis, Chicago, Joliet, they're the three big lanes out of Ontario. Rates down 40 cents a mile. Rates have dropped 20% last week, although volumes are up 20% last week. So we were seeing the reverse. If you remember last week, we were talking about lower volumes, higher rates, which sort of tells you there's capacity tightness on some of those lanes. This week, we're seeing the reverse, a complete flip-flop. So now we're seeing volumes are still moving, which was what we were talking about off air, which is a very interesting subject. But capacity has started to get back to where it needs to be as carriers have figured out what new lanes they're running, whether they're going to run cross-border or not, what rates need to be charging. Because Dan, 3 weeks ago, we were talking and you said carriers are falling off loads even after they committed to them.
Oh, yeah.
Rates were
wanting
doubling.
More money.
Yeah, I heard it from a lot of folks that do cross-border freight. Even on the southern border, they were talking about rates having doubled, but most of the rate volatility was on the Canadian border. Mm-hmm. So I think you start to see a shift, a sizable shift now where you're going to see if your provincial trade barriers come down, less trucks running cross-border, more intra-Canada freight. Let's assume that's the outcome of this. And different lanes, like different trade lanes. So you may see more longer haul to the West Coast for exports to Asia. But what you'll see, I think, is more capacity coming back into the market intra-Canada, which, of course, in theory, will put downward pressure on rates. So nationally, last week, rates dropped about 2 cents a mile. They're down to $1.64. Dan, our rate cast model, which is really, really accurate. I mean, it's only got a 5 to 6% error margin, so it's in in the mid 90s accuracy. It's got rates down to $1.48 per mile out to April 17. That's going to have rates slightly lower than where they were a year ago. So a year ago, dry van rates were $1.55 a mile. Ratecast is expecting rates to slide a little bit further, another 8 cents a mile down below where it was last year on April 17. So there's a little bit of deterioration in the rate forecast. The $1.48 excluding fuel, we're starting to hit rock bottom for a lot of carriers that have been getting by for the last couple of years. New rates entering routing guide on the contract side of the market up 1 to 2%. So, but nothing like the normal market inflection we typically see. You're still seeing contract rates coming into routing guides relatively flat to slightly up, which again jives with what shippers tell us. They expect moderate inflation level increases in rates year over year by year end. Our rate forecast has rates up maybe 3% year over year by the end of the year, like on the spot side of the market. We're still seeing capacity exit the market, right? So we're still in this period of time where, Dan, I don't know how long we're going to talk about being at the bottom of this freight market, but we've been talking about this for over a year now, where rates have been bottoming out, capacity is trying to find where demand is, but demand, because of the tariff uncertainty, is disappearing rapidly down the road, and carriers are trying to chase that. It's the same in the rail business. We had Rick Legore from Intech Logistics on our show yesterday. It's a really interesting discussion about how they see freight rates over the course of the year. Contract in the intermodal space, a lot of them are talking optimism, but there's growing skepticism that intermodal carriers may be lucky to secure rate increases. The rates will be certainly modest in terms of the railroad side of the business. In fact, anecdotally, we heard this week that a couple of the big carriers have swooped in at the 11th hour to slash rates in order to retain business. Mm-hmm. So on the intermodal side, that's a worrying concern, and we should talk about maybe this on the show next week or the next couple of weeks. But Rick Legore has a intermodal spot index, and he said that one of the things he tracks about when the market's going to turn is when intermodal spot rates and truckload spot rates start to go up together. He said that over time, it proves that the market has flipped. And he said that's not happening right now. And he said the reason is very simple. Intermodal spot moves on the railroad side are only about 5% of each train, for example. And he said intermodal provides an outlet for 53-foot capacity when the truckload market's tight.
Yep.
You would know that, having done some work on that. So he said when truckload rates go up and then intermodal spot rates go up, the market's flipped. But he said we're not even there yet. We're a long way from when that's going to happen. So here we are a year later, and I'd say that because I was just looking at my presentation at the Mid-America Truck Show last year, which is next week.
Yep.
And I was wondering what sort of messages I was pushing out then. And of course, we were more optimistic then. We thought, the market will improve and it'll pick up in the third quarter. And of course, it didn't. We had a fairly soft third and fourth quarter, relatively speaking.
Kind of like when COVID hit, we all said, it's going to be 5-6 weeks.
Yeah. Wow. So in the interest of being consistently wrong, we were thinking we'd see 2025 being a recovery year. And I remember reading a Bascom Majors report early in the year, and he said 2026 will be the bounce back year. This was early January, and I thought, no way. And of course, here we are with truckload volumes, according to Jason Miller's truckload ton mile index that came out in January. Truckload volumes are flat year over year. They're about the same as where they were in 2019. Not a great year for truckload carriers. When you look at a lot of the indices that we track, the external data points around new orders and production and manufacturing, then they all kind of been bouncing around for a couple of years post-pandemic. So there's nothing on the horizon that really says the market overall, to use that rising tide lifts all boats analogy. I suspect there's going to be some big fall-offs in some markets and huge increases in others. As your customers on the northern side of the border in particular readjust their supply chains, because that takes time to readjust and get things in place.
It does. I know. I see certain things happening. So I know we've got reports that Worldwide went out of business this week. JBT. I still haven't confirmed Heritage, but I mean these are three fairly large companies in Canada, right? I think Worldwide, the last thing I read was 220 units or something. So from a US perspective, it's not a very big company, but from a Canadian perspective, it's fairly large.
Right.
I know Worldwide was heavily into Honda and a lot of automotive, which I think is very volatile.
Yep.
Unconfirmed reports I read last night about Ford Motor Company pulling all Mexico facilities and bringing everything back to the US. I don't like, there's so many different feeds coming in, and I find now more than ever, like if you look at what New York Times is saying about Doge and all this, it's very hard to conclusively determine what's real and what's not.
Right.
But I can say this, over the last couple of weeks, the biggest thing for Canadian carriers is how am I getting home? Right. And so what we found was normally when we would have an outbound, they were asking for round trip rates.
Yeah.
Because we don't know, as a Canadian company, our suppliers are like, I have no idea what is going to happen south.
Right.
Because I could get south and all of my stuff could be stopped. I mean, to the point where we had, so a lot of things that aren't talked about is overstock items.
Right.
And how much they're being tariffed.
Yep.
Right. I think last week I told you about a company we work with that deals in springs. And springs went from $3,000 to $9,000 because they were overstock items.
Right.
And people are saying, how is this possible? Companies in the US are ordering product they think's from the US, and then they're getting hit with tariffs because the companies are actually ordering it from China.
Right.
So there's all these areas in our business that are so, I'm going to say gray, and almost in the aftermarket area.
Yeah.
And you start looking at that and you start analyzing your business. And, I can tell you our business, I mean, our US side is getting bigger. I've had so many sales reps contact me this week and last week and say, do you know when I'm calling companies, they're apologizing for what's happening? Like
Really?
they're apologizing, and I'm
Wow.
going, really? And I mean, it was insane. I mean, I got a list here because I make sure I had this open for you today. I mean, I got a list here of the people saying, I don't understand what's going on. They're apologizing to me, and it's, you know, you look at this weekend, all of the rallies and all of the protests that are going on.
Yeah.
I do know Canada specifically. I mean, we're already pivoting.
Yeah.
We're already pivoting to say, okay, how do we mitigate this for clients?
Right.
I helped a client last week come up with new companies in the US to source products from, and actually realize that if we actually source the product from Canada, use the exchange rate compensates for the actual tariffs if they ever do go back on. So like, we're opening up these streams, and we're starting to think in, rather than siloed, we're starting to make the connections. And I think, you know, in the end, Dean, I do fully believe everything happens for a reason. And I think in our market, even more, and if you remember kind of towards the end of December when we were talking about, you know, what's the big thing, the collaboration piece that I said, like 2025 is going to be collaboration.
Yeah.
I'm finding that more now than ever. That collaboration is the way to get things done. And more than ever, customers, prospects, shippers, manufacturers are looking for the professional that knows what they're talking about and doesn't just read an article and say, oh, that's got to be verbatim. Like, right. I mean, how many articles do I send you about the same topic every morning? Right. Like you and I are shooting things back and forth at a lightning pace. On the way to the office yesterday, I was with one of my colleagues, and you and I were going back and forth. And he looked at me, he goes, man, like, to have brainstorming partners and mastermind partners like you have, Danny, goes, like, wow. He goes, because I'm like going back and forth with you and like 5 different people, and it's all an exchange of ideas. It's collaboration on, hey, what's happening? How do we make ourselves better? I mean, even you and I this morning, I'm saying, Dean, I really need you to help me with this software and teach me at A to Z. Because I think for us as logistics professionals, Dean, the more people we talk to, the more stories we get, the more we put it into a frame, the better we're going to be. And I think the siloed approach, which, let's call it spade a spade, in logistics, it's siloed. Like very few people say, this is my customer, because everybody keeps so much close to their chest. But I think that's going to be the death of people this year. I really do. I think it's going to annihilate their business. It's going to segregate their customers. And it's going to create friction that doesn't need to be there. And I think if anything right now, it's eliminating that friction as fast as possible. Like we look at Canada, right? Immediately Canada starts looking to Mexico for produce, because they're saying we're, and it's not even so my personal opinion on it is now it's not even about tariffs. It's about instability. And I think there's a big difference, because, you know, the article that I sent you this morning, you know, why these tariffs are impossible to keep, right? And what a tariff means to the actual country. Forget the consumer, talk about the country, right? Because multiple consumers equal a country, right? Like we just have to look at the economics of it. And we start looking at this, and countries are going to go just like we would in our own lives. If there's instability, we're going to get away from it. Right. Because we don't want that. And as an economic system, that instability kills. Kills, because nobody knows. And we see it like last week. Like we actually asked customers last week, do you need to ship this today? And they're like, why? We said, okay, here's the situation today. Because of the instability, I have to charge you double. And they're like, what? And we do. Like, and one of my colleagues, he was telling every customer, if you don't need to ship, don't ship this week. And so you think of that from a collaboration piece, because a lot of salespeople out there, their sphincter probably just tightened up. They're going, what? Like, I'm not going to make, but he was like, no, if you don't have to ship this week, don't ship this week, because he cares more about the collaboration than the commission.
Huh.
So it's one C over another.
Huh.
Which C are you going to choose?
Right.
And I think this is the biggest thing in our industry right now is what is the collaboration? Can you hold it for another 3 days?
It's interesting, Dan. I wonder, last week you talked about the importance of Chicago, because I asked you about why Chicago is such a big outbound hub for Toronto, and you're talking about the cross-border volume. So I mean, the data's wild. If I look at outbound Toronto, right, volumes are down 9% week over week, but inbound, they're down 28% week over week. So you got this big imbalance in and out of Toronto going on right now. There's places, we were talking last year about Sudbury and all the growth in warehouses up there and some of the problems. Does it become an alternative longer term to Chicago if this trade war is prolonged? Like, do the economics of, instead of Chicago going to Sudbury and then doing your Trans-Canada, that would work in the summer, would I be right? But not winter? Or does it not matter?
No, I mean, it would depend on what's happening in the areas, because whether, like in Canada, whether it's winter or summer, if something's going on, it's going on. Like, so another data point that you should watch is the California Chicago. So if you can pull that data up, I'd be interested to see, because majority of stuff will come in, get railed from California or trucked from California to Chicago from warehouses and then be distributed there. So it's a more like the California Chicago lane is a pool distribution lane, right? Instead of hub and spoke. So it pools in California, pools in Mexico or Nevada, pools in Texas, runs to Chicago and then gets distributed, because Chicago is that center hub to kind of like that centerpiece for all points Canada. That's the rail.
Got it. Okay, makes sense, Dan. Because 30% of the intermodal moves go Los Angeles, Chicago. So it's got all the class one railway. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So and then if you look at the data for truckloads to Chicago as well, because of the consolidation aspect in California.
Yeah.
So if it came in on ocean and there's like 5 pallets of this, 10 pallets of that, 5 pallets of this, 3 pallets of that, 2 pallets of this, 7 pallets of that, they all get consolidated in trucks and then they truck it to Chicago. They go into, that's why a lot of companies have major warehouses in California, major warehouses in Florida, also major warehouses in Chicago. Right. Like Frontier Supply Chain is a big one that has those 3, that triangle cornered off, because if you look, you got, LA, California, across to Miami, that lane, right? So you have the warehouse alley in between, right? In that Tennessee, Kentucky, all that area. And then you also have the Chicago. So that triangle is some of the largest freight movements, as we've talked about many times. So I'd be interested to see what the data is from California to Chicago, and if that volume is down. Because if that volume's down, that's a key indicator. People are ordering less from the US or overseas into Canada.
Very interesting. So volumes from Chicago to Toronto are down 45% week over week, rates down 45 cents a mile. They're down 12% year over year. So that's very interesting, Dan. Joliet is the other lane that's probably, so Joliet's very similar, because a lot of the warehouses on the railroad side also occur.
Just outside of Chicago, where it's less taxes, it's cheaper. And so on and so forth.
Very interesting. So if I go to California outbound rates, because we're past the peak shipping season there, volumes are relatively flat. If I go to Los Angeles, volumes are up 1% week over week. Rates are up 3%. So
what about like LA to Illinois?
Yeah, I'm hopefully gonna pick that up very quickly here. So I got Los Angeles, Chicago. Here we go. Los Angeles, Chicago down 9% week over week. Volumes. But they're up 21% year over year, but that's because we had that massive influx late last year on the import side to get ahead of tariffs. So some of the record volumes, remember we just saw the highest February ever for import volumes, in particular into the West Coast. That caused a bubble of freight to move. You listen to some of the earnings calls of the Class 1 railroad IMCs, like the big intermodal carriers. They were busy repositioning a lot of empty 53s to the West Coast to load them to come back this way. So it looks like the bubble has kind of moved on from a volume perspective on that lane, because rates are coming way back down. Well, they're down 3 cents a mile on that lane, down 6 cents a mile month over month, but up 13%. So some of the year-over-year comps are being dragged up by this high volume we saw in last quarter of last year.
And that's what's going to be tough, right, Dean? Is this segmenting what is the pull forward versus what is just people saying, no, I'm done.
Yeah. Well, I think railroad's about $1.26 on that lane. I think I could be off by a few pennies, but road ex fuel on that lane to Chicago is back to $1.46. Last time it was $1.46. Well, if I go back and look at all of 2019, rates were like $1 a mile back then. We're kind of heading directionally back towards where that market's been longer term. Yeah, very interesting. I was curious about Sudbury. So Chicago's going to be a play, right? Regardless. So Canadian carriers might just or companies, they would have to have a domicile address in the US, right, to come into Chicago and then send it to Canada. Well, I guess they're still going to get caught with tariffs bi-directionally anyway.
I mean, it will, and it's kind of like what we spoke about prior to jumping on here. In the end, like anything, if the product's needed, people will pay.
Yep.
Right. I got a buddy of mine, obviously everyone knows I'm huge into snowmobiling, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, $30,000 for a snowmobile, like that is asinine. And he goes, Dan, if you want to, you got to pay to play.
Yeah.
And like it's just what it is. And so if you want to do it and it's something you're passionate about, now that obviously that's a big difference than a business perspective.
Right.
But if we look at it and we say, hey, we're a company that produces, pens. People still need to write.
Right.
So, okay, pens go up. If you like pens, like I'm addicted to pens,
right,
I'll pay for the pen. Now, maybe I'll be more cautious about when I'll try new things, but I'll pay.
Right.
And so, I consistently go over, what are we doing as a country? What are we doing as individuals? How do I stay ahead of the change curve? And I think this is where collaboration, the more people, like you and I communicate 15 times a day in the morning, usually 15 times before 8 a.m. Just sharing stories. And then at nighttime, hey, I saw this. What are you hearing? That's collaboration, because it adds to both our intellect and our understanding of the market. Then you go out and talk to somebody else and you glean little pieces of data. And you and I are doing this all day long. The siloed companies, the siloed individuals, I believe, are the ones that are going to lose and lose big this year. Because we just can't be siloed anymore. Like people say, there's no money out there. There's no money out there. Well, there's companies out there that just secured $25 million for tech in logistics specific. Right. There's companies out there that are soaring. There's companies out there that are doing big things in the industry because they're not staying siloed. Like one of my colleagues did an absolutely fabulous job connecting us with a fully integrated North American rail network.
Right.
Like amazing job, Dean. Already yesterday, we just connected it yesterday morning. We finalized the deal yesterday morning, signed all the documents. Within an hour, we already had freight going on the intermodal network because our customers but we're now saying, okay, here's your OTR, here's your IMDL. Which one do you want?
Wow.
And they're like, you know what? I can wait the extra 4 days. Send it this way, because the savings now, if there would be a tariff, is the tariff savings. So now it's dollar for dollar almost. They're saving it. They're helping their customers save it. What is that going to do? That's going to help them buy more. Right. So I actually see the intermodal skyrocketing this year, and with that comes pros and cons, obviously, right? The pro being, okay, we can utilize lower rates until it becomes a con where now volume rates need to go up because capacity tightens.
Right.
So it's this flip flop, and then it'll flip back to trucks, and then it'll go back to so it's just understanding the markets, playing it, and for all of you salespeople out there, it's staying in tune with what's happening.
Right. Dan, I was just looking at some data here. This is kind of interesting. While you were chatting, I was just pulling the intra-Canada data because I was curious to see what would happen with intra-Canada capacity. And again, these are spot market moves, so it's not the total of the market, but there was and I'd be interested to see if this is sustained over coming weeks, but this is intra-Canada spot rates up 12% since the election back in November. But up most of that though was up. It's up 10% in the last
like 2 weeks or something.
Last 2 weeks. So capacity's tightening for intra-Canada moves, but there was a noticeable inflection in the rate per mile intra-Canada.
And your next thing to watch, Dean, is going to be how many companies are starting to cancel U.S. Authorities. Right. And U.S. companies canceling Canadian authorities.
Right. So then the inference is that if you've got fewer carriers, then what capacity's left, capacity could tighten if demand returns back to anywhere close to normal. Wow.
Yeah. And the inter-Canada is now in dealing with. So there's a few things, right? We talked about this a little bit last week, right? Canada's looking at signing deals with Mexico for produce and all this kind of stuff. We're looking to the European Union. We're looking to other areas. We're even renegotiating with China. We're doing all sorts of things to, my wife is probably one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life. And she said something the other day. She said, it's interesting because in times like this, we should all band together.
Right.
But on both sides of the proverbial fence, I think we're more separated than ever.
Right.
Like we're seeing in Canada, liberal conservatives, NDP, we're seeing a segregation and we're seeing the gaps increase, which, left and right in the US has been for years now, probably since the first term of the current president, there's been and maybe even longer, but I think we've seen the separation more. Right.
Yeah.
And depending on what side you sit, good, bad, indifferent, it is what it is, right? It's kind of like religion. If somebody is left, right, conservative, liberal, there's no convincing them of the other thing. They believe it to be, the gospel.
Yeah.
But I look at it and I again say, okay, everything happens for a reason.
Right.
What are we learning from this? And how do we as sales professionals, how do we as logistics professionals get better with what's happening? And that for me is the biggest question. It's like, okay, so it's happening. I mean, I have no control over it, Dean. When I go to bed tonight, when I wake up tomorrow morning, I got no control over what governments do. I can share my voice, which is a speck of dust in an entire ocean by voting. Right. We have that behind us. Things like my local town, they spent $35,000 on a logo. It took me 3 minutes to find that exact same design on a system called Envato Elements, which is $110 a year. I downloaded it. I duplicated the logo in 6 minutes on Photoshop.
Really?
And we paid $35,000 for it. So I'm having a conversation with my colleague on the way home yesterday, and he says, why are we should be voting on where that money's spent. And I said, I agree, but you're never going to change that. And so are we going to sit here and dwell on it? Or are we going to then say, okay, this is, I've gathered this data. This is why data day is so important, because we give people the information they're striving for, but we pull it together. Just so everybody understands, like when Dean and I build these shows out, we build them out from multiple sources of data. And it's, if you talk about rate view and IQ and data IQ, you're pulling from millions of data points. Constantly. There's over 1 billion data points in IQ. And when you have that kind of vast data set, you can look at things and, you know, like you said, you're upwards of 90-something% accuracy for predictive models. That's huge. What do you think I do every day? Every day I'm looking at predictive models and I'm saying, okay, how is this going to impact my customer in these lanes? I'm looking at taking the IQ and amplifying it out through our entire company. And, you know, one thing that we're looking at right now is how do we utilize more with less? Like, how do you, and this is extremely important. I mean, I remember the last company I was at, I would say it all the time, and we're going back to 2016 now, like 11 years ago, where I was going, guys, we need to be more interconnected as a company. There's like 23 offices. I have no idea what carriers Dean is using, but you know what? I bet you if we got together, we can round trip people left, right, and center.
Exactly.
And that's what we're trying to do now.
Love it.
Is because if we have a carrier going out for something and they're saying, well, listen, I don't know what's going to happen with a round trip. I need to charge you double.
Right.
I need to charge you a round trip rate. What if somebody else in another office has something to come? Now you're working as a team, collaboration.
Dan, just in the interest, maybe we could wrap up the show on this, but there's something going on intra-Canada that I'd love to get your take on, because when I look at the rates intra-Canada, there's something that's so if you look at the outbound, so outbound Toronto is 204, right? So that's cross-border. But when I look at intra-Canada rates, spot rates excluding fuel at $1.80, they're up 22% in the last year. So there's something been going on in the last 15 months with intra-Canada rates. So go back to 2015, which I've got rates on. You know, for the longest part, they rates were in that $1.35 range from 2015 all the way through to 2018. So the pretty low rates intra-Canada. Long-term average is $1.54. They're at $1.80 today. So rates have been going up. If you look at the long arc of time, they've been going up. Exclude the pandemic. There is capacity is tightening intra-Canada, has been since 2017. If you
is it east to west or west to east?
I don't have a direction. No, I don't have a direction. But I guess most of that's going to be east to west, right? Because that's where the volume moves.
Yeah, well, I mean, depending, right? West to east is volume from overseas, from Asia and stuff, right? Because again, it hits the Vancouver port or the BC ports,
right?
You know, all the way up the BC side. East to west would be stuff that would normally hit the Gulf of St. Lawrence ports, right? The Montreal and so on and so forth. So it depends on where the product's coming from. But the inter-Canada, there's a few pieces of inter-Canada that have significantly changed. One is the east to west has slowed down versus west to east, obviously. And so we have companies, large steamship lines, that are actually looking at putting together truckload and LTL programs to get containers back west, which has never happened before because they just throw it on a train and they're done. I think our train capacity, hence the CPKC merger and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's all of these pieces of the puzzle that are finally falling together. I believe the inter-Canada, we're going to see much more of that because I'm already speaking with suppliers and they're saying, yeah, we're probably going to stop going to the US. And just because, so and it's not just to do with tariffs, everyone, there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle. Okay. One being, call a spade. We have more immigrant drivers now. And a lot of them are not necessarily very proficient in English. So when they get to the lower states, they're treated differently. Call a spade. I'm sorry, racism is everywhere in the world. No matter where you go, as a white person, I go somewhere, I get treated, you know, like it is what it is. And anyone that says different really is not educating themselves. There's racism everywhere. So there's that. And you think about it, like my neighbor, very proficient in English. He's an Indian gentleman and his religion is Punjab, or I guess culture is Punjab. I shouldn't speak. I'm not sure of religion, but so he used to do US, and he just said, you know what, Dan, I just I got sick of it. Like he goes, so now he does inter-Canada, he does Montreal, Toronto runs for a Canadian company.
Yeah.
And he says, it's just what I do.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, you know what? He goes, Dad, I don't have a desire to deal with it anymore.
Yeah.
And he goes, and he's not an ill-spoken person. He's a very positive individual. I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and that's what it is. There's different elements to crossing the border. Not only that, you look at some of the areas of US Canada, like if you run Toronto, Montreal, there is a huge section of the 401 corridor that's very difficult to navigate in winter.
Yep.
Now you contrast that with like running the Donner Pass in winter.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Way more difficult on that area. Way more difficult going trans-Canada than inter-Quebec, Ontario.
Right.
So there's all these pieces of the puzzle, but in the end, what makes for a better life balance? And I think that is one thing that COVID taught every industry. Right? Like if you think about it, what was the big thing when it came to COVID? It was the, drivers home every week, every night, home on the weekends, more home time. So you start looking at that. And, now with the tariffs and everything else, I think it's adding to that. It's kind of like electric cars when COVID hit. Everybody wanted electric cars because they were driving less. Now it's like, oh my gosh, I'm having range anxiety because I'm back at the office. You know what I mean? It's interesting. It's just going to continue. But like everything, Dean, it's all an evolution, and you can either choose to evolve with it or choose to let it run you over.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that's for sure, Dan, is change is constant. What a great time to be in logistics.